One of the goals Washington had was figuring out how to fund the federal government. And recall that taxes, excise taxes are taxes on a specific type of good. As the name Whiskey Rebellion suggests, this tax was on whiskey. Now, it's the primary concern in the summer of 1794, and it stemmed from the 1791 whiskey tax, which was proposed by, you guessed it, Secretary of the Treasury Hamilton, that would raise money for the federal government. Now, corn was extremely important to the West, and many farmers owned small stills to convert it into whiskey. We know that corn whiskey even served as currency for many farmers who did not have cash. This tax is extremely upsetting to these farmers who did not feel as loyal to the federal government, and they resented the power of federal inspectors to inspect their barns and cellars. If you can see the picture in the background, that is a tax collector being tarred and feathered, and that would be a government building on fire. Now, this issue is in Western Pennsylvania. The protests mainly centered in Western Pennsylvania, upstate New York, and the Ohio River Valley. One of their big issues that it was that not a single one of their representatives in Congress voted for this tax. None of them voted for it, but yet it was still taking effect. They resented it. So that's where a lot of this discontent stemmed from. Now, Washington was hesitant to use force to put it down, but constitutionally speaking, he was assured that he had the authority to mobilize the militia. So our commander in chief sends in the troops, and not only does he send in the troops, he personally marches with 13,000 to put down the insurrection. It's the only time in American history where a sitting president will actively lead troops into a combat situation. Now, Washington leads them about half the way, and then Hamilton leads them the rest of the way. But obviously, these rebels, they hear, holy cow, Washington's coming with 13,000 men. The mob had dissipated. There was no violence in the Whiskey Rebellion. In Shays' Rebellion, there's violence. There's combat, there's shooting. People die. That doesn't happen with the Whiskey Rebellion because the so-called rebels got out of Dodge. They left. It raises an interesting question. At what point is the federal government authorized to use force on its own citizens? In this case, the law was not being upheld, the law was being flaunted, much less not respected, so Washington sent in the militia. This will certainly raise the question at where does it end? In the 1950s, schools were supposed to desegregate. And I bring this up because President Eisenhower in the 50s took an example from Washington. Both were men who rose through the ranks of the military and were generals before becoming president. Schools were supposed to be desegregated. There were 9 black students who were refused entry into a predominantly white high school. The governor of Arkansas, because this is in Little Rock, Arkansas, the governor called in the National Guard to prevent these students from entering, and Eisenhower was furious. So these students personally were escorted to and from their class by federal troops. Eisenhower called in the army to make sure that the federal law was upheld. So the Whiskey Rebellion deals with excise taxes, and it's certainly one of the more interesting points during Washington's 2 terms as president. But it certainly begs that question again, at what point is a president authorized to use federal troops to enforce the law or to make sure the law is upheld and respected?